Why does this cost $40? So we're starting up a new series called The Record Business. And episode one is going to be about why are vinyl records so expensive? And I think what we're seeing is that in the current market, records are going anywhere from 40 and up for single LPs. And it gets a little more wild when you're talking about box sets and double LPs and colors. So I want to give a little bit of a framework around this from a manufacturer's point of view. So if you're looking at Spotify or streaming, typically you have an $8.99, $10.99 is your monthly subscription. So you're saying, well, why would I want to spend $40 on a physical record? So what we're going to dive in today is really looking at the kind of the culture of vinyl, but more about from the manufacturer point of view. Folks who have jobs every day at the plants that are through US and Europe, and seeing how that relates to the current cost and what that really means for the market. So I think the thing that typically out on the manufacturing side, what we hear is that the consumers are paying too much for a record. And why in the world is it so expensive? Are collectors driving up the prices because on Discogs they can get $1,000 a record? Is that driving up the cost? Or is it the record labels themselves? Are they just charging too much because they're greedy and they're wanting to line their pockets with the physical product? So I think there's a lot of myths out there. Doing this a long time, started the record label portion in 2011, hand drawn records, and then hand drawn pressing with my business partner. We started it up in 2014. So we've kind of seen the start of this thing, coming at it from as one of the new manufacturers that we were the new kids on the block, kind of seeing this early on where this trend was growing. But now we're at 19 years of double digit growth year over year and a little over $1 billion in sales last year in 2025. So I think it's a good time to have this conversation to start dispelling any myths. And this first one is really just around the why. Why are records so expensive? So let's really look at it. So if you are streaming and you're getting your music off streaming, you are not buying the records, of course. You're not buying it from the artist. I think everyone knows that it's not even pennies on the dollar that the artist is going to receive from a stream. Streaming has its own universe going on, and physical is on its own terms. So you're not buying a stream, of course. You're kind of renting it from the Spotify's of the world or streaming it on YouTube, etc. But when you're buying a manufactured product, you're buying that directly from the artist, or of course, you're buying that from the label who represents the artist. And then there's a whole chain of people that are involved in that purchase. So it starts at, yes, the studio side, and then it goes from there into what we would call the supply chain for vinyl record manufacturing. And then it goes through a whole chain of distribution and then into retail or wholesale and then to you, the fan. So let's start with the idea that records used to be cheap. It said, hey, if I were to go on Facebook or Instagram right now and have this kind of conversation, I think we'd see a lot of comments populating in that were, hey, I used to buy records for $5, etc. Yeah, that's true. In the 1970s, at the height of vinyl record manufacturing, that was the case. At that time, there's a lot of factors, but at that time also, the biggest one that's not really talked about, the record pressing plants were owned by the major labels at that time, meaning that the labels could control their costs kind of from a start to finish. So they own the studios, they still own the studios if you're talking about major labels. And then they would, of course, own the manufacturing itself. Most of that chain was vertically integrated, meaning the PVC, which makes the record, the printing, which is specialty to vinyl records specifically, the facility itself that manufactured the records. They owned all that. They probably didn't own the shipping companies, at least maybe not all the way at that time period. But again, in the 1970s, that was, yeah, record for $5. And some of it you could say is tied to inflation. We all know that things don't cost here in 2026 the same that they cost in 1976. Things, of course, cost a lot more in general, but that seems like a really high growth. So you could say, if you look at the numbers, a $5 record today really averages out to about $35 in today's inflationary, just dollar to dollar. I think that's fair. And just say, hey, things cost more and deal with it. I think what I really want to get to at the beginning of this series is really say, hey, here's other people who are impacted, who have jobs because of physical media, because of making records, because of making CDs. that maybe those jobs didn't even exist 5 years ago, definitely not 10 years ago, and absolutely not 20 years ago. Things have been going well for the market when it comes to physical records, and we can talk about the numbers a little bit later. But what happened is in the early 1990s, essentially all the record pressing plants did not exist anymore. So the last record press that was manufactured, meaning the actual manufacturing of the press itself, was in the early 1980s. And at that time, the major labels kind of started shedding, if you will, these manufacturing plants, these record pressing plants. And they started, as they got into the early 90s, they got into CDs. And then by the time you hit 91, 92, vinyl was dead. It was gone. And the majors then primarily owned all the CD manufacturing, just as they had owned the vinyl record manufacturing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So what happens when an entire media dies or a medium dies? The plants close or they sell off for parts. The majors sold them off and maybe a few were acquired here and there. The equipment started disappearing. So a lot of it was shelved. A lot of it was put off into the corner, mothballed, wrapped up for come see me in the future. And some of those record presses that are still at some of the legacy plants were from that time period, from the 70s and from the 80s. And they are what I would equate to like an old car. You just keep it running, you keep putting parts on it, and you keep replacing parts, manufacturing parts. If you went to Cuba just a few years ago, you'd see all the 1950s Chevys driving around on the streets, and they just have them held together, for lack of terms, with duct tape, right? So those things are still running in those places, and that'd be the same idea with record pressing. Is you have very old presses that have been updated in some cases or not updated, fixed, made to work. And what also happened, of course, besides the equipment itself, is the skilled labor, which to me is the more important part. The skilled labor that was wrapped around vinyl record manufacturing that had been there for decades, all that knowledge was gone. So the labor left, they went and got jobs other places. If they were mechanically inclined, perhaps they started working on an auto shop, going back to the auto thing, or anywhere else. Demand is started to return. So for 19 years, again, going to that double digit growth, some of the folks that were running those plants back in the day or had kept the knowledge base going in those dark decades of no sales and just kind of holding on for dear life and finding how to keep the business going if they were specifically in vinyl record manufacturing. And then what was pretty awesome about our industry is as you got into that growth period, if they were still around, they share the knowledge and they still share the knowledge today. So going back to the beginning of those 19 years ago, and even when I got into the industry back in 2014, 12 years ago, some of those people, the reason we know what we're doing today is they share the information. They said, look, here's how you make a good record, because they care about making amazing records. They've always cared. And so you have, and we'll get into what the supply chain means, but basically you have specialists all along the line, not just in the plant, that have to be able to share that with a new generation. And that's still being passed on plant to plant today. And if they're in a specific sector, being passed on. And I think that's one of the really amazing parts about this industry. So yeah, demand came back faster than the infrastructure. And so that's caused some of those pricing problems, which is of course the what we're talking about today. And so since the demand came up hot and heavy, people were able to charge the plants, basically they got charged more for the raw goods. So really to understand that pricing, we need to understand what the supply chain is. So what does it mean when we're talking about vinyl record manufacturing? The music itself has its own set of processes. We're not going to really talk about that today. That's the studio side. But quickly, of course, you have the musician, they have the idea, they get into a studio, they record it, and then you have a mixing engineer mix down that record, and then you have a mastering engineer master it for whatever medium it's going to be in. So on the mastering side, you can master it for Spotify, you could master it for YouTube, you can master it, and these are different algorithms they have for, of course, the physical medium, which is CD. And then, of course, there's a mastering, pre-mastering set that needs to go for vinyl itself. What happens after that point is now you get into where you get into the specialty side of the supply chain is what's called the cutting engineer. So there's a cutting house or a solo cutting engineer, and they have what's called a record lathe. Okay. And kind of like the record presses that were from the 1970s, the record lathes, save one new manufacturer, are from an old time period. Same idea as the record presses. You have people who care for these things, they keep them in well maintained, and they put new parts on them if there's new parts available. And it's a highly specialized area. We've got to see some really awesome studios in our years, most recently for the VRMA, the Vinyl Record Manufacturers Association, of which I'm the president, one of the co-founders. We got to go to Nashville just a few weeks ago and got to visit with Pete Lyman and his team at Infrasonic. We got to go see Sterling Sound. Ryan and Joe were nice enough to have us there. And then we finished it up with the day at Welcome 1979 Studios in Nashville. Has recording services and has this cutting service I'm talking about. But it's a lathe that is cutting the vinyl master into what we have in the US is a lacquer disc. Overseas, they also have what's called DMM, that's direct metal mastering. The DMM process is a little bit different. It just takes out a step when it comes to the next set of specialists in the supply chain, which are the plating folks. So there are plating houses or plating companies that are doing electroplating galvanics, and they're taking a lacquer, and what they're doing is they're making a metal master of that. And when they have the metal master, the lacquer is discarded, and now they have a metal representation of the music. And from that point on, they are able to rip what's called stampers. So the metal master is called a father, mother, and then the stampers are called children. So those children or stampers are what go to the record pressing plants, get put into the press itself and get affixed to the mold. And those stampers get destroyed during the manufacturing process. They don't get destroyed every time, but they get destroyed most of the time. So there's a certain number of units that can be pressed on a stamper, and it's doing what the name says. It's stamping the grooves into the hot plastic, into the hot PVC. So a stamper stamps the grooves into the hot PVC, and when it opens up, so it superheats it, opens up, and it super cools it, and now you have misshapen disc. Then the record press operator then either automatically or manually trims the excess, so you then have a perfect circle, which is the vinyl record disc that we're all used to seeing. And then that's cooled. And then, of course, after that point, you have the next set of folks, which are usually on the plant and can be offsite. Those are the packaging folks. When you're done with making the physical record itself, the next person in line is going to be the packaging and the quality control. So you're going to have quality assurance, quality control. Quality assurance typically is listening to the record, making sure, assuring that there's quality of the disc itself. Quality control is going to be looking for more physical defects. They're going to be looking for imperfections in the disc. Is the disc misshapen? Is it warped? Does it have little marks all over it? Does it have scratches? Does it have pock marks? Is the center label affixed correctly? So that's quality control. And then the quality control folks then say, okay, these are good to go. Hand it off to the next people, which are putting the records into a sleeve into a jacket. They're physically doing this one by one, hand done, one at a time. So you're looking at a disc one at a time. You're then passing it off to the next set of people who are physically putting it into a sleeve and then jacket one at a time. Those people are also looking out for quality issues when it comes to print. So printing, you cannot go to, I'm a little bit older, so I'd say Kinko's. I don't know if Kinko's exists anymore, but you can't go to Kinko's and say, hey, give me a record jacket. Here, just print it out and fold it and hand it to me. It doesn't work like that. The jackets, like I showed here, this is a specialty jacket. This is a gatefold for a double LP. As you can see, it's got artwork on the inside, artwork on the back, and then it's got pockets for the records, pockets for the records. The jacket printing itself, this specifically is one big piece of cardboard, but the complication is in the folding and in the gluing. So to get something like the spine, as you see there, the spine that has words on it that you can see it on the shelf, that's super complicated for a printer. And that doesn't matter if it's single LP or if it's double LP. Let me show you a single. Here's an example of a single. This is a standard single jacket. You can tell in just a pocket in the middle. Spine's a little thinner. See that? Mine is just a little bit thinner, but still complicated. Now look on the inside, you could probably see the folding and the gluing. So that little tab is folded right there. You can see that. That's folded over and glued, and that is all inside of a machine that is specific to the vinyl record manufacturing industry. Printers don't just have those. That's not normal. Something to do, not just the printing, the finishing. If it has a matte finish, if it has a gloss finish, if it's like this one, it's uncoated, which is pretty sweet. If you can tell from the camera, uncoated. And this has a little bit of a sheen to it. And you see the light kind of reflects off of it. That's a different finish. That's a different set of complications that the printer does. So specialty printers. Okay. So specialty printer, they deliver the stuff to the packing facility and or the record pressing plant itself. And those people put the record in the jacket one by one. Then the final step, shrink wrap, goes through a shrink tunnel, marketing sticker if it has one, into a box onto a pallet onto the next one, truck. Freight is going to be a huge piece of this. So we're talking about cost and we're talking about what are all these steps. So a quick review, that company one would be the studio itself. Company two sometimes can be a mastering studio. Company three can be the cutting studio, which actually cuts the master. Company four, galvanics or plating. Company five, the pressing plant itself. Company six, the printer. Company seven, the shipping company, the freight logistics company. And then after that, you're going to have distributors, company 9, and the label itself, company 10. And then guess what? The artist still hadn't got paid yet. So that's company 11. If they have a website fulfillment, maybe company 12. So I hope that what I'm stating here is that every step adds cost because this is something physical. This is something real. This isn't something that just lives in the cloud. So I think that's inherent and people understand that's inherent. However, I think it always bears repeating. So let's look at where that money goes. Use an example of $40 retail record. Manufacturing, state of that. Packaging, got it. Freight, just said it. Warehousing, so that's not just warehousing the print before it gets packed. What we're stating here is the warehousing after the record gets to somewhere. Distribution, it's got to go somewhere. It gets shipped to a big distribution place. They have to then pick it, pull it, and send it off to be sold at a store. That is called retail. And then, of course, you have the label operations. They do all the marketing for the artist if they're signed to a label. And then the artist royalty itself. You can put a little side note, and I'm going to in a little bit about the artist and if they're not going through a label, what that really means. A key point about $40 a record does not mean somebody made $40. That's huge. All right. So because it's split up amongst all those different companies and they all have different percentages and different costs. Transition is going to be, what about the independent artist? Okay, they're not on a label. We're talking about a label. We're talking about the big boys. Well, guess what? Up to that certain point after shipping, okay, everything up to that point is exactly the same. So until you got to the freight company X, right? Until you got to or after the freight company, I'm sorry, all the costs were the same. So they still had to spend the same amount of money and the same amount of time and energy as somebody who's on a label. The difference is why you're going to buy direct. So ideally, the artist without a record label can afford to charge a little bit less to the end consumer for a record. It doesn't have it to be $40 to make more money than they would on a label. And I think you're starting to see, or at least we're starting to see, hand-drawn is at our level, a lot of artists kind of shedding those traditional models, making records on their own, just like they've for years been making t-shirts and hats and koozies on their own, because they understand this is a huge part of revenue for them. Artists are on the road. They need something to sell at their merch table. And the vinyl record is massive for that. You have your local events that these artists are playing on, and they're able to sell at the merch booth. That's huge profit to them that allows them to sustain the lifestyle that hopefully the fan enjoys. The other one is they do get to put them at record stores, even without distribution per se. Most record stores, most indie record stores, not the big box, are able to take them on consignment. When I was a touring musician in my 20s, we would make CDs at that point. We only made one vinyl record at the end of my career with the band. And we had CDs and we'd go into local record shops like Good Records in Dallas. And we'd say, hey, can we sell this? And they'd say, yeah, no problem. How much you want to sell it for? I'd say, I want to make $10. And they say, no problem. And they would mark it up for 14. They'd buy the inventory right there from you, or have you come back and get a check every 6 weeks or whatever, see if you sold through and if they wanted more. So consignment is huge. And the reason being, you don't need middlemen. You don't need anybody taking those percentages. If you're an independent artist, you can literally, if you're brave, which if you're a musician, you're on a stage, you're pretty brave typically, get to a record store, go talk to them. They're cool. They want to know about you and they want you to sell records. No middleman is great. And that means less margin is going to be gobbled up. So really, they can have a one-to-one correspondence with the record, meaning they're going to buy it from us, let's say at hand drawn for $5.50, and they can go off and sell it for $11 at the merch store or at the merch table, and they double their money. So it's pretty straightforward, and that's how we like tell artists a lot of times. It is an investment. Making a vinyl record is very expensive, typically because of how many units you need to make. And if you don't make enough units, meaning like 500 and up, you're making under 500 units, the cost per unit can go up dramatically. But if it's a super specialized unit, you can pour your heart and soul into it or do something unique with it, whether signing units or something crazy with the packaging, et cetera, something for your fans or super fans that you know you're going to sell those 100 units. You might buy them for 20, but you could sell them for 50, and then you're still making way more than the signed artist that had to sell it into a big box store and it was $40 on the shelf or $50 on the shelf, and they got a small percentage of that dollar. It's a huge, huge boon, I think, for independent artists, and that's typically who we work with. But I just want everybody to understand it's specialists at every area, right? So we talked about the cutting engineer. This is someone who has spent years getting their craft together. They had to have others pour into them to share how do they do what they do and how do they do it well. And that's a big deal, right? These are people that spend sometimes their entire lives getting really good at their craft. So these are specialist, craft oriented people. And then because it's such a big deal at the very beginning, what I feel like, and again, being president of the VRMA, which is all about supply chain, we talk to plants all the time. And, what I think we see is that the press operators, they really care, right? So they don't want to have anything screw up in the process because it's such a delicate thing. But at the very beginning, somebody poured their heart and soul into it as the artist, as a musician, the recording musician that recorded this. And then you have the cutting engineer who poured their heart and soul into it. And then you have the pressing plant who is like, I can't mess this up, right? I've got to do my job to the best of my ability. So you have the whole level of specialists at the plant. You then, at a quality pressing plant, you're going to have people really watching the quality, making sure that they're cross-checking everybody within their own company. And then they're also cross-checking their vendor base, right? The plating galvanics people, again, this is not just like somebody comes in on a Tuesday, you train them, hey, you're going to be the new guy that is running the electroplating department. Hey, go sit over there and just pull those parts out when they're ready and put them over on the side and send to the plant. No, a lot of training. A lot of things can go wrong in the electroplating side. And then again, you have the plant. And then lastly, you have printers. And they also care about what they do. Typically, these printers, especially printers, are making other things, right? They're making postcards, they're making booklets, maybe they're making CD packaging, they're making posters, they're making banners. They're making things that are pretty cool, but there's really nothing cooler than a vinyl record. And it's just art personified. And then the one in the chain that maybe, I hate to say, is not a specialist and doesn't care is typically the freight companies. So because of that, what we spend a lot of time kind of communicating at the plant level is how well can we wrap these records up? These are the babies, right? I'm going to make sure that these are put together in a way and boxed in a way with the right, very specific box that's very thick and is not going to break down very easily so that it can handle all the rough and tumble that will happen on the freight level. And then even better, if it's a large enough order that can go on a pallet, we can wrap that thing up tight and secure, put corners on it, put all kinds of extra shrink and little things on it so it doesn't get stacked and get damaged during transit. And of course, cannot forget one of the big ones, talking about cutting out middlemen. One of the things we love is having people come by and pick up their records in person. Not only does it save that we know they're not going to damage it because they're putting it into their own truck or van or hatchback or sometimes not a hatchback, and that's kind of hard to fit them all in a car because they're large and heavy. But they are coming and we get to meet them, right? So we've been in conversation and in relation with these artists for several months, typically, especially independent artists. It's their first record. So we're working with them over a long period of time. We've traded dozens and dozens, maybe even 100 emails with somebody. And then we get to meet them, which is super cool. And hopefully it's meaningful for them. So I just really wanted to make sure that everyone knew how complicated the process is when it comes to how many companies are involved and how many touches. And then in later portions of this, we're going to actually dive into what those companies are doing much, much deeper. This again was the starter. Here's everything, kind of throw it all at you at once. And then what we want to do is just dive into the story behind the records after that point and kind of look at these things one at a time. What's the manufacturing process look like? Kind of do some deep dives in different areas. And I think it's always helpful. And to me, it's interesting and exciting. So hope you're interested and excited, and we hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.